Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar organized by the Human Rights Research and Education Center of the University of Ottawa and the Canadian Embassy in Peru. It is our pleasure to host this webinar to discuss the social protests and the human rights challenges that are happening right now in Peru. And for today, we have a great panel with people that have been working and following the conflict in the country for the past 2 months. And it will be it will be our pleasure to foster some of the discussions to try to explain or to try to make sense, if this is possible, about what is happening in the country. So for today, we're going to have the opening remarks, first of all, by Mr. Andrew Ng, who is the political counselor of the Canadian Embassy to Peru, and followed then by the opening remarks by Professor Jabbar Fatali, who is a professor of the section of Droit Civil at the University of Ottawa and the interim director of our Human Rights Research and Education Center. Andrew, welcome, and you have the word. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Salvador, and also Director Fatali of the Human Rights Research and Education Center. It is a real pleasure to be able to support your center in this important and timely panel with the esteemed Senor Garcia Sayan, Professor Burt, Ms. Mitra Taj. C'est un plaisir d'appuyer la traduction pour cet événement afin d'échanger des perspectives à travers les frontières et parmi le contexte bilingue au Canada. Es un gusto apoyar la traducción para este evento con el propósito de intercambiar perspectivas entre Perú y Canadá. I will keep the rest of my remarks in English so as to not give our translators a headache. It's a particular pleasure to be back virtually at the University of Ottawa, where I started master's studies 15 years ago, but was unable to complete them before departing for a posting to Pakistan. My career at Global Affairs has taken me to Afghanistan, Nigeria, Mali, and now Peru as well, where I have been actively engaged on democracy and human rights issues throughout in often challenging security environments. In each of these places, as we do around the world, Canada has worked alongside our partners from civil society, academia, the media, and local governments to promote and protect human rights. Here in Peru, Canada has been a long-standing partner in support of democracy and human rights. We played a leadership role in supporting the transition to democracy and accompanying processes of dialogue and national reconciliation in the early 2000s, including supporting the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Defensoría del Pueblo, or the Ombudsman Office. More recently, we have continued to work with partners across democratic institutions and civil society to reinforce human rights as Peru has experienced political turbulence with 6 presidents over the past 6 years. Following the unconstitutional attempt by former President Castillo to close Congress and install a government by decree on December 7th, 2022, Canada was quick to condemn these actions. Canada proceeded to recognize the succession of Vice President Dina Boluarte to the presidency in line with the Peruvian Constitution, along with the vast majority of the international community. Subsequently, as the crisis evolved and involved a mix of civil and uncivil protests, Canada has repeatedly emphasized the right to peaceful protest, the need to respect the rule of law and human rights, and for security forces to respond proportionally. In response to the tragic deaths of civilians, Canada has called for transparent investigations. Canada has reiterated these messages in public as well as through diplomatic channels to the President, Foreign Minister, and other interlocutors. We have also raised these messages on January 25th during the Universal Periodic Review of Peru at the UN Human Rights Council and at the Organization of American States. On January 30th, Canada played a key role to achieve regional consensus on an OAS declaration expressing concerns about the excessive use of force by authorities and calling for accountability for human rights violations. I look forward in particular in hearing from Senor Garcia Sayan about how we can further support OAS and UN human rights instruments. Just this morning, in response to the relentless attacks and intimidation of journalists during this crisis, which I know Ms. Mitra Taj will speak to from a much more personal vantage, the embassies of Canada, the UK, and the US issued a joint statement of concern about the state of press freedom. We affirm that responsible journalism is essential to democracy, and authorities must assure the protection of journalists. It is important to recognize that the government of Peru has taken steps to address some of these concerns, including welcoming human rights delegations from the OAS Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, from the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights of the UN, and Amnesty International. The government of Peru has updated on the status of investigations into these civilian deaths, supported early elections, and extended an offer of dialogue to affected communities. Canada will continue to work with our human rights partners and dialogue with the government of Peru on these points. In recent weeks, the embassy has consulted with the Coordinadora Nacional de Derechos Humanos, the Defensoría del Pueblo, and the UN Office of Human Rights to discuss next steps. In closing, I would note that we share the concern that Professor Burt has written extensively about, that the current crisis is reopening wounds from the decades of civil conflict in the 1980s and 1990s that claimed the lives of over 69,000 Peruvians. In my past experience, one of the themes I have seen is that justice is a requirement for reconciliation and social cohesion. And in democracies, political leaders have a solemn responsibility to represent all citizens and secure forces to protect all citizens. With this message, I look forward to hearing from the panel about ways in which Canada can support human rights and democracy in Peru. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your kind words. And before I give the floor to Professor Fatali, I would just like to remind everybody who's attending this webinar that we have interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. So if you look to the lower right part of your screen, you will see a globe with the term interpretation, where you will be able to choose the language of your choice. So without further ado, Professor Fatali, welcome to this webinar, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Salvador. So hello, everyone, and dear guests, and welcome to this interesting webinar on the political crisis in Peru. So on behalf of the Human Rights Research and Education Center, I would like to say thank you to all of you, but with a special thanks to our member and our colleague, Salvador Herencia, for all the work he's doing to promote the rule of law, to promote the human rights, and especially to educate the public on many issues related to democracy and the human rights. And this event is a proof of what he's doing in our center. Today's event is very important for us here in the center. Is a way to encourage and to promote dialogue, and also to discuss many issues and many challenges that the Peruvian people are facing today, and the impact of these challenges on human rights and democracy. So needless to say that here in the Human Rights Research and Education Center, we encourage all the initiative that, and we support all kinds of initiatives that promoting dialogue and mutual respect. Je tiens à remercier chaleureusement tous les participants à ce panel. Ce panel est important parce que nous, ici au Canada, nous ne connaissons pas beaucoup, on suit ça dans les nouvelles, mais le public canadien ne connaît pas beaucoup de détails sur les dessous de la crise au Pérou. Le Pérou qui a donné à l'humanité des juristes très intéressants, très importants, et c'est un pays qui est connu toujours que ces changements politiques ont ont façonné enfin le domaine du droit de la personne. À chaque fois qu'il y a une crise au Pérou, le droit de la personne, c'est ça le bon aspect, ça avance un peu. Donc j'espère que je vous souhaite tous les succès. J'ai vraiment hâte à entendre et à comprendre mieux la crise au Pérou et surtout les facettes des droits de la personne qui sont mises en cause dans cette crise que, espérons-le, ne va pas durer et que les Péruviens seront capables pour assurer une bonne transition et rétablir enfin la paix sociale chez eux. Je vous remercie infiniment. Vous avez tout mon support. Je suis tout oui, comme on dit en français. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you, Salvador. We are proud of you and we are proud of all our members. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Fatali, for your kind words. And before we start, just a couple of ground rules. One, I invite everybody who is attending the presentation to please submit your questions or your comments in the Q&A. I will also moderate the discussion, so I will try to, in a way, present the questions as much as I can. So the first speaker and each speaker will have approximately 10 to 12 minutes. I'll give you a polite warning once there is like a minute and a half long. And our first presenter is Mr. Diego Garcia Sayan, who is a Peruvian lawyer, and he has been Minister of Foreign Affairs. He has been judge and president of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And lately, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. But most importantly, he has been pretty much my boss for the past 20 years, whether he wanted that or not. That was not up to his choice. And it is a great pleasure to host Mr. Garcia Sayan once again. Diego, you have the floor. And thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Salvador. Really, I am honored to have been invited this morning to share some views in a fantastic context that Canada offers, the government of Canada and the Human Rights Center in the university, which both I have had during the last years close connections and follow very closely what Canada has made, for instance, in Peru, when we had the democratic transitions more than 20 years ago, in which Canada played a fantastic role to support that process, and as well to the decision to adopt the Inter-American Democratic Charter that was presented by the transitional government. And of course, the Human Rights Center and the Human Rights Clinic that gave me as rapporteur a fantastic support to perform my duties as rapporteur until that term finished some months ago. Y muchas gracias por las introducciones del señor Andrew y del señor Fatali, que han adelantado ya algunos aspectos centrales de los problemas y de las preguntas que la crisis peruana motiva. El trasfondo ha sido mencionado por el consejero político, la turbulencia, la crisis política con 6 presidentes en 6 años. Pero hoy, para ir a la coyuntura más reciente, a partir de la elección de Pedro Castillo a mediados del año 2021, que se abre una fase adicional de crisis y de tensiones políticas, en donde insólitamente desde antes de que el señor Castillo hubiera asumido la presidencia, ya había reclamos de un sector extremista dentro del sistema político, exigiendo su destitución cuando ni siquiera había asumido funciones, delegaciones que iban a la OEA alegando un fraude una fraude electoral que nunca se pudo demostrar porque no existió, ¿no? Entonces, ese es un antecedente que daba cuenta del clima con el cual se recibía a este señor que venía de los Andes, de ser un modesto profesor de escuela primaria, un modesto dirigente sindical, ¿no? Vinculado a un partido de izquierda que no había sido muy conocido hasta ese momento, y al que fue, como se sabe, Castillo invitado, un poco por casualidad, por una serie de circunstancias pequeños votos en la segunda vuelta, fue elegido como contraste frente a una abrumadora cantidad de gente en el país que no quería que fuera elegida la hija del ex autócrata Alberto Fujimori. Por eso salió elegido Pedro Castillo, una elección legítima que cumplió con los estándares nacionales e internacionales, pero que fue ya parte de una crisis que arranca es con el boicot sistemático a su gestión, bloqueos en el gobierno, ataques desmedidos, interpelaciones a sus ministros, ya a ritmos prácticamente alucinantes, una cara de la moneda. La otra cara de la moneda, por supuesto, fue la ineficiencia inmensa en la gestión de Castillo como presidente. Más de 70, 80 ministros en un lapso relativamente corto de tiempo, una notable incapacidad en la selección de personas de condiciones apropiadas para conducir las instituciones públicas, que se tradujeron, entre otras cosas, en una disminución radical en la ejecución del presupuesto público a niveles, en algunos momentos eran incluso inferiores a los de la mayor crisis durante la pandemia en el año 2020, que es algo que demuestra que ahí había indudablemente un problema, y adicionalmente una sucesión de denuncias de corrupción del entorno del señor Castillo, que crecientemente se acercaban a personas que decían, sí, yo vi que se le entregó dinero al señor Castillo. Fueron denuncias que nunca se llegaron a probar porque las investigaciones recién arrancaron. Ese viene a ser el capítulo primero. El segundo capítulo es el frustrado autogolpe de Castillo el 7 de diciembre del año pasado. Un gobierno que estaba siendo acosado, pero que también tenía sus propios elementos de crisis interna, que realmente representaba ahí un problema muy serio. Toda la gente en el Perú se quedó desconcertada ese 7 de diciembre cuando se escuchó a Castillo repetir, perdón, tengo aquí una interrupción que tengo que resolver con un perrito. Perdón. Entonces, ahí hay un tema complicado, ¿no? Porque el autogolpe de Castillo fue una parodia del autogolpe de Fujimori en el año 1992, con la lectura de un discurso casi idéntico al que leyó Fujimori en 1992 cuando hizo un efectivo y exitoso golpe de Estado articulado con el servicio de inteligencia, altos oficiales del ejército, la policía, etc. En este caso fue un bluff, el golpe de Estado no existió en términos efectivos. De inmediato este señor fue detenido cuando estaba yéndose a asilarse en la embajada de Japón, y a las pocas horas destituido por el Congreso en aplicación de la Constitución, y como bien ha sido aquí resaltado, asumiendo la presidencia, siguiendo el orden constitucional, la vicepresidenta Dina Boluarte, ¿no? Entonces, esa es la primera parte con lo cual arranca pues la crisis intensa que se vive a través del 7 de diciembre, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son los tres elementos que yo caracterizaría de esta crisis después del autogolpe? Primero, una masiva reacción de protesta, particularmente en las zonas del sur andino, que son aquellas que habían votado masivamente a favor de Castillo, con quien había una relación de identidad, no necesariamente ideológica, pero sí étnica y cultural, pese a que Castillo no es un quechua hablante. Una reacción masiva, auténtica, de un sector de la población que, como digo, el 90% había votado por Castillo, y que conservaba por esa simbología todavía un apoyo importante en esa zona, llamemos Puno, la frontera con Bolivia y Cusco. Se inicia automáticamente una protesta social auténtica y legítima de la población, ¿no? legítima quiero decir porque ellos sentían que se les había quitado a un presidente y no habían seguido el curso del detalle de si la Constitución permitía tal o cual cosa, ni si se había tratado o no de un golpe de Estado. En segundo lugar, un hecho real, ¿no? Muchas de estas manifestaciones de protesta hubo presencia de intereses específicos minoritarios que no deslegitiman las protestas para nada, pero que sí naturalmente explican ciertas cosas extrañas, como ataques sistemáticos a instalaciones judiciales. 17 o 18 instalaciones judiciales fueron atacadas, expedientes procesales, penales, incendiados, y una serie de cosas que no tenían que ver directamente con una protesta social, sino que se dirigían hacia objetivos que alguna gente vinculó a sectores del narcotráfico o sectores de traficantes de oro ilegal, pero que bajo ninguna circunstancia pueden permitir legitimar el discurso de que, bueno, estas protestas eran protestas de terroristas, manejadas por terroristas, y que cuyo único propósito era promover el terrorismo del Perú, porque eso sería absolutamente falso. Ese es el segundo elemento, esas protestas que tienen ese matiz que es importante reconocer objetivamente. Y en tercer lugar, la respuesta desproporcionada del Estado, ¿no? Es un hecho que ha sido visto internacionalmente, una violencia sin control, que si bien se dijo públicamente, lo dijo la presidenta Boluarte, de que no se utilizaran armas de fuego, sí fueron utilizadas armas de fuego. De los más de 60 muertos, hay 48 que han fallecido por uso de armas, por balas disparadas por equipos que tiene el ejército o la policía, y no en situaciones que no eran las de un ataque, sino muchas veces personas que estaban auxiliando a otra, y situaciones en todo caso que con las reglas de Naciones Unidas y las vigentes en el Perú de control de ese tipo de manifestaciones, era improcedente e ilegal utilizar armas de fuego para disparar al cuerpo de las personas. Entonces, ese es el panorama que se ha dado en un contexto que naturalmente después de 2 meses de protestas, estas han tenido que ir bajando en intensidad, aunque todavía continúan en algunas partes del país. Entonces, a partir de aquí, con esto trato de concluir, se abren temas, interrogantes sobre 3 asuntos fundamentales. Primero, ¿qué hacer con estas violaciones, estos abusos, estos excesos o violaciones de derechos humanos que han sido cometidas? Lo que está expresado en las comunicaciones que acabamos de escuchar, bueno, que estas sean investigadas seriamente, rigurosamente y objetivamente, cosa que mucha gente duda que se esté haciendo con la energía, con la intensidad que se requiere o con la que le puso la fiscal general del Perú para otro tipo de investigaciones cuando había que investigar la supuesta corrupción a Castillo. Una de las reacciones que empieza a hacerse desde un sector extremista de derecha dentro del Congreso y fuera del Congreso es que ante estas investigaciones que se vinculan a comunicaciones de la Comisión Interamericana y órganos internacionales de derechos humanos, es que el Perú se retire del sistema interamericano de derechos humanos, que es un discurso que corsi y recorsi aparece eventualmente, que tiene limitadas posibilidades de concretarse y que bajo ninguna circunstancia impediría las investigaciones que hoy día se exigen por hechos que se han ocurrido cuando el Perú es parte de ese sistema interamericano. La segunda pregunta, ¿cuál es el futuro de Castillo? Castillo ha sido destituido por el Congreso, está procesado y está en este momento detenido. Castillo ha presentado su caso a la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, alegando que se han violado normas de la Constitución, pidiendo su libertad y su reposición como presidente, cosa que se vincula naturalmente al intento de algunos de decir, bueno, la manera de librarnos de esto es saliéndonos del sistema interamericano de derechos humanos. Si eso se hace, en todo caso es muy tarde para hacerlo, porque el caso de Castillo ha sido recibido por la Comisión Interamericana y es un tema que ahora se está discutiendo mucho, cuál sería la viabilidad jurídica del reclamo de Castillo. Y la tercera pregunta, ¿cuál es el futuro del actual gobierno? Un gobierno que tiene todo el apoyo del Congreso, o el mayoritario y contundente apoyo del Congreso, que Castillo no recibió. El mismo Congreso le han dado incluso al gobierno facultades de dictar leyes sobre ciertas materias durante 2 o 3 meses, y han apoyado todas las propuestas que presenta el gobierno de Dina Boluarte. El Congreso es repudiado por el 93% de la población, que exige que el Congreso se vaya y que haya un adelanto de elecciones, un gobierno que tiene un respaldo muy pequeño, pero en todo caso superior al que tiene el Congreso. El rechazo a Dina Boluarte es alrededor del 70%. En cualquier caso, las ideas y las maniobras que se han hecho para impedir que se adelanten las elecciones parece que han prosperado, y la idea de que se hagan elecciones este año ya quedaron definitivamente de lado y se abre la posibilidad de que se realicen el próximo año. De manera que habría la posibilidad de que este gobierno con este Congreso repudiado continúen hasta que termine técnicamente su mandato, que es en el año 2026, o que se presente alguna crisis política mayor adicional en el curso del próximo año que obligue a que esta elección se adelante. ¿Cómo se puede adelantar? Algunos dicen que renuncie la presidenta. Bueno, si renuncia la presidenta, de acuerdo a la Constitución, asume el gobierno el presidente del Congreso, que es un ex general del Ejército, que tiene que convocar a elecciones, dice la Constitución. Y el Congreso, la gente del Congreso interpreta que convocarían a elecciones para el gobierno, pero no para el Congreso. De manera que las figuras de salida política constitucionales son hoy día complejas, en una situación que yo creo que ha sido difícil de encontrar en el Perú en las últimas décadas, de tal nivel de distancia, de gap entre la legitimidad de los órganos legislativos y el respeto por parte de la ciudadanía. Entonces, se abren grandes temas de inseguridad y naturalmente es muy importante hoy día mantener la vigilancia, mantener la tesis de que en el Perú ni nadie puede retirarse del sistema de derechos humanos para ocultar investigaciones, para impedir que se indague en casos de violaciones de derechos humanos. Me he extendido de los 10 minutos, me excuso por eso, pero había muchas más cosas, como ustedes comprenderán, son a ratos más las preguntas que las respuestas, pero fantástico que tengamos aquí a Joe Marie y a Mitra, que han seguido los acontecimientos de Perú con mucha calidad y con mucho detalle, y yo reposaré con todo lo que escuche, tanto de Joe Marie como de Mitra a continuación. Muchísimas gracias, Salvador.
No, muchísimas gracias a ti, Diego. Y sí, estamos bien de tiempo, entonces muchas gracias. Sorry, thank you very much for your presentation, Diego. It's always insightful to get this context of what has led us to this situation. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Jo Marie Burt. She's a professor of political science at George Mason University and the current vice president of the Latin American Association, LASA. In addition to that, she is perhaps one of the most knowledgeable scholars from North America to have researched about Latin America. She has written and researched extensively about transitional justice, democracy, social movements in Latin America, but mostly Guatemala and my home country of Peru. So it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you, Professor Burt, today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salvador. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research Center and to the Canadian Embassy in Peru for organizing the panel and for inviting me to participate. First, I want to say that I really appreciated Diego's very thorough and brief, remarkably brief overview, given how thorough it was. I think what I'd like to do is focus in on a couple of elements that he's already touched upon, but I want to maybe go a little bit deeper. And I think one of the questions that I often get from students or from journalists is why we all know that the initial protests that emerged after Castillo's arrest and Dina Boluarte's assumption of the presidency emerged in the southern Andes of Peru. But people ask, why are people, demanding Castillo's release and return to the presidency if he tried to carry out a coup? And so I think that's a really important question to try to get at, to try to understand some of the origins of the conflict. Diego mentioned that the regions, the South Andes were regions of strong Castillo support. He received 90% or higher in many of the districts in regions like Puno and Cusco, where the protests are primarily centered, where they originated in particular. And I think the identity factor that Diego mentioned is also very important. Castillo, a rural farmer, a school teacher, a union leader from Chota, one of the poorest towns in northern Peru. For many Peruvians in the Andes, it was the first time they could vote for someone like them. But it's also someone who was promising fundamental economic and political change. So I don't think that it was just an identity-based identification with Castillo. It was also about his platform of social and political and economic change. Granted, once in power, he actually did astonishing little to make that platform a reality, but that's another matter. And there was a lot of hope placed in Castillo as a president, not just because of his identity, but because of his platform for change. So for these voters in particular, the removal and arrest of Castillo represented what they perceived to be the culmination of efforts by the right-wing Congress and their allies to thwart and remove Castillo from the presidency. Diego already mentioned that those right-wing groups had tried to prevent Castillo from taking power. They actually denied his election victory in 2021 through, those of you who are from the United States, you know the term, the big lie. It's happened here in the United States with Donald Trump, the idea that elections were fraudulent and his victory was stolen from him. Well, Keiko Fujimori, who was Castillo's opponent in those elections, maintained a similar discourse. And so from the very beginning, there was an effort to not allow him to take power. And I think it's important to remember there's one little anecdote that during the effort to declare those elections fraudulent, these right-wing groups sent dozens, maybe even hundreds, I'm not sure of the number, of very well-paid lawyers into the hinterlands of Peru to try to get ballots of poor indigenous people nullified, because remember, Castillo won only by 44,000 votes. And so their thinking was, if we can nullify 45,000 votes, then Keiko's the winner. And that action of trying to nullify the votes of poor rural and indigenous people, I think really sticks in people's mind. This is an effort to deny their right to choose the president that they had selected by especially folks from sort of middle upper class Lima. I think that division, Lima provincias or provinces, is a background factor here that's extremely important to keep in mind, and perhaps we can continue to talk about it. And there's one other moment of this early scenario that I want to highlight that I think is also illustrative of how people, and not just Castillo's initial voters who came out and said we want Castillo back, but a broader group of Peruvians in their understanding of the current moment. And that was when Boluarte was inaugurated by Congress, right? Remember, Boluarte was elected vice president with Castillo on a leftist ticket of Perú Libre, right? And he's gone, and she had said at one point about a year ago in Juliaca that if Castillo were forced out of office, she would go with him. And here she is receiving the presidential banner, the presidential sash rather, from right-wing members of the Congress, and saying she's going to stay in office until 2026, which is in effect would have been the end of Castillo's mandate. And then the moment following, the right-wing members of Congress are taking selfies, very happy that they'd finally achieved their goal, which was the removal of Castillo. And remember, they had tried on a couple of different occasions to remove Castillo through the vacancy clause in the Constitution, a very vague constitutional figure that we can discuss further, deeply problematic, has been a cause of a lot of the instability Peru has experienced over the last several years because of its misuse, I think, not necessarily just because it exists, but it is a vague clause which facilitates that abuse. So that those two things, her saying I'm going to stay till 2026, and these right-wing members of Congress, thumbs up, all smiles, we finally got rid of him. And keeping in mind that these right-wing members of Congress are the very same people who, for the last year and a half, had been denying that Castillo and Boluarte had been legitimately elected, And we're trying to remove them from power. And another point that's often lost in the discussion, just a couple of days before Castillo's failed self-coup, the Congress archived an investigation into Dina Boluarte over some abuse of authority charge that was meant to remove her from office as well. And suddenly that disappeared. So you have, I think, in the popular understanding of what's happening, this idea that Pedro Castillo is gone. His vice president has taken power in alliance with the right-wing members of Congress who lost the elections, and she sort of turned herself over to them. So she's now either forged an alliance with them or perhaps is actually under their control in a way, right? She's sort of supporting her presidency on the right-wing leadership in Congress. I think that's what helped fuel initial protests. And I think the second thing that's led to the continuation and expansion of the protests is the way the government has dealt with the protests from the very beginning. So 4 days after Dina Boluarte was sworn in as president, the first killings happened. 2 young people, one 15-year-old, one 18-year-old, were killed in Apurimac, Dina Boluarte's home department. And that kind of fueled a huge outcry. And in response to that, Boluarte announced that she would propose to the Congress moving up the elections to April 2024. Now, a lot of people, some people said this is an important concession. Other people were like, April 2024 is a very long time away. We don't think it's going to calm the waters. And it really didn't. Protests continued, as did the deaths. And rather than rein in the security forces and try to establish a clearer use of lethal force against what, are legitimate protests, aside from the fact that there have been acts of vandalism and violence, but these are certainly minority groups. And it's not even clear who these groups are, and the investigations into that have not advanced very far, which is, I think, another important thing to point out. Hang on a second, I just lost my train of thought. Okay, so instead of, I got it back. So instead of reining in the security forces, Dina Boluarte declares a state of emergency on December 14th. In other words, she sends in the military, and she's suspending certain constitutional guarantees. And the result was a tragedy foretold. The very next day, in Ayacucho, the epicenter of the violence during the 80s and 90s, during the internal armed conflict between the Peruvian state and the Maoist Shining Path, 10 people were killed. And the government tried to claim that these were people who were trying to take over the airport, and therefore that's why they were killed, which is not really a justification for people being killed, number one. But number two, we know now, thanks to the incredible research and documentation by journalists, including Ideales Reporteros and others, that the people who were killed were not anywhere near the airport and had represented zero threat to anybody. In other words, these were extrajudicial executions. And there have been, as we know, as Diego already said, 48 killings by police and army in the context of this 2.5 months. In addition to that, there have been hundreds of people wounded. I think the number is nearly 1,800 if we include police officials who've been wounded. Dozens of cases of arbitrary arrest, and increasingly focused on the supposed organizers of the protests. Even though we know that and maybe Mitra will tell us more about this, we know that the Minister of Foreign Affairs told the New York Times that the government has no actual evidence that there are criminal elements organizing or manipulating these protests, right? So we have 48 civilians killed by police military in these last 2.5 months, dozens of people wounded, arbitrary detentions, very concerning, the conditions, the treatment people are receiving, including a few accusations of sexual assault in the context of these detentions, and so on and so forth. So there's a real human rights crisis that's emerged. The government has, I'm probably getting close to the end of my time, but I just want to say, I guess two things to wrap up. One is the government's response is kind of a little bit, trying to think of the right word, not paradoxical, a little schizophrenic, maybe. Because on the one hand, the government has maintained a very consistent discourse that the protests are essentially illegitimate, that those participating and organizing these protests are either criminals, drug traffickers, or terrorists, or foreign elements connected to Evo Morales, right? And this red baiting, there's a term that Peruvians have even developed for this, not just in this context, but before, because unfortunately it's a common practice in Peru to terruquear someone. Terruco comes from the Peruvian slang for terrorist, terruco. So to terruquear someone is to accuse them of being a terrorist, usually with no evidence, usually spuriously, with the aim of stigmatizing them, removing their legitimacy, intimidating them, generating fear, and trying to undermine their legitimacy in the public eye. So there's been a very consistent effort by the government to delegitimize protests by connecting them to terrorism or other criminal activity. Again, with no real support, no real evidence of this. And that narrative effort has a very clear objective, right? It's to not only dismiss the legitimacy of the press, but it's also to justify the repression against them, right? So that's one thing I wanted to highlight. And the last thing is this question of accountability and dialogue. The government has called for an investigation into these killings, even though they deny. In fact, Boluarte has said consistently, we didn't give the orders to shoot. We didn't give the orders to repress. We don't even know if it's military and police, even though there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it is. So there's a denial on the part of the government of any responsibility. So kind of shunting this off to the Fiscalia, the public ministry, to investigate. It's important that those investigations happen, right? That's a part of a truth and justice process in any case of human rights abuses. But there is also political responsibility here, right? The Minister of Interior, the Minister of Defense, the head of the cabinet have a political responsibility, because the killings have continued. It's not like there was one killing and then they cleaned up their act. There have been and then in January, there were a whole number of killings in January. It's not like there's only one incident and then they cleaned up their act. No, it's been a continuous practice. So that's a problem. The other element of that's problematic is there's a great deal of doubt, as Diego noted, in the independence of this Attorney General and therefore of the investigation. And the fact of the matter is there has been impunity for police violence or security sector violence in democracy over the last 20 years. The Human Rights Coordinator has documented nearly 200 people, civilians killed in the context of protests by security forces. Only one that I've been able to document, police official, has been charged and convicted. So it's like, to me, kicking the can down the road and saying, oh, well, we're investigating it, and therefore, there's nothing more that we can do. I have a real problem with that. And the last thing is this question of dialogue.
Just to wrapping up.
Absolutely, this is my last point, El Salvador. The government has, yes, indeed, said that it wants dialogue, but who do they want to dialogue with? I mean, we've seen images of meetings with members of the current Congress, with Keiko Fujimori, but the government has really not created channels for dialogue with protesters. And the fact is, the way the government has repressed and has red-baited protesters, there's no confidence in a dialogue. There's a fundamental problem of legitimacy of this government that makes dialogue extremely difficult to achieve. And I'll stop there to pass the mic over to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Berg, for your presentation. And I would like to invite the people that are attending this Zoom to pose some questions. Some questions and comments have already been posted. Please feel free to present your questions in English, Spanish, French, and also Portuguese, as I see some Portuguese speakers in the audience, if that's the language that you prefer. In the context of these social protests or police or political and social division, the role of the press is very important. And in the way that they shine a light on what is happening on the ground and give us the information for us to make whatever is, or either inform ourselves or to adopt some actions that we can within the realm of our possibilities. So it is my absolute pleasure right now to welcome journalist Mitra Taj. She's based in Peru, and she has written for The Economist, the Christian Science Monitor, and Argus, and the New York Times, among other media outlets. But I wanted to highlight how the reporting from Mitra and other foreign correspondents have been instrumental to shine a light on the racial and ethnic divide that exists or fuels the current social protests. And that is important for all of us to understand that this is more pro or against X, Y, or Z person. So, Madame Taj, welcome to this course, welcome to this webinar, not a course yet, and you have the floor.
Hi, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Very interesting comments by everybody, and it's a pleasure to take part in this. I'll add a little bit from my view as a journalist here in Peru. I've been here for more than a decade. Most of these years I was working for the Reuters news agency. I'm freelance now. In general, in Peru, it's been very easy to work as a journalist. I mean, in the sense that there's no real kind of restrictions from the government, that kind of a thing. So people are happy to speak. There's lots of lively debate. But by far, I think this is kind of the most challenging time for journalists in general. And I mean, both journalists on the ground covering the protests that are in the midst of the violence, and also journalists who aren't and who are kind of part of targets of these kinds of campaigns to discredit or cancel some journalists. Actually, since this conflict began, or these protests began, there have been more than 160 attacks on journalists. That's according to the National Journalism Association, Asociación Nacional de Periodistas in Peru. Most of those have been physical, and most have been by the police towards journalists. I've really lost track of all of the different incidents involving colleagues that I know and don't know who have been, pushed by police, forced to stop reporting, threatened with death threats. My colleague, for example, Pau Gas, who works for ABC, the Spanish newspaper, on February 4th, I think it was the biggest protest in Lima, was kind of thrown up against a wall by a police officer. Just during an ambush of a group of protesters by police. There's been Alair Mejia, an FA reporter, who was told, not to, by police, that basically threatened with death, and then later was hit with a tear gas canister. There have been journalists who have lost their jobs because of their coverage, most notably Carlos Cornejo, who worked for state media and TV Peru, and his contract was not renewed after he reported on after he showed footage of a police officer firing a tear gas canister that ended up killing a man at short range, shorter than what is allowed by the manual of police. So just kind of no shortage of attacks, and it's very worrisome because this is a time, I think, when we need more news coverage of things and in different ways as well. The initial attacks were by protesters in general. Actually, one of the biggest vandalism attacks were against 3 different television networks. And then you saw also journalists that were working in the field, reporters, photojournalists who were attacked by different protesters because they are perceived as working for la prensa mercenaria, which is often what it's called, mercenary press, or a press that has sold out. There's a strong kind of sector in the far left that sees mainstream media as working against the interests of people. And that's in part because there's been a big drop in trust in media in general in Peru. I think the last time that Vanderbilt University did their lap-up poll that showed that only 30% of people trusted media, and about 70% had low trust in local media. So this is all a part of, I think, the kind of deterioration of democratic institutions, or the deterioration of trust, I should say, in democratic institutions that we've seen through, just one crisis after another in Peru. And not all of this is totally new. Actually, one of my first experiences as a journalist in Peru was, I think I was helping AP with an investigation. I was in Cajamarca and went to the local protest against a mining project called Conga, a gold project, and clashes broke out immediately. And a local TV journalist who was kind of running around together got beat up in front of me by a police officer, and the police officer threatened me as well. So I think just as police abuse isn't new in Peru, neither are these kinds of attacks on journalists. They've just all kind of come to the forefront now because there's this conflict, and it's, the levels that we're seeing are, I think, unprecedented and since the return to democracy. Now, there've also been arrests of journalists, and there were 4 different journalists from Puno who were arrested in the San Marcos operation, where police used a kind of a tank-like vehicle to tear down the gate of university and arrest protesters that were there with the help of university students. And then you also have kind of the campaign to cancel journalists, which actually I and other foreign media journalists have been the target of that. I was kind of surprised. This is the first time I've kind of been in this kind of a campaign before. There are several other journalists who for years have faced this kind of harassment, you could say, by far-right groups. And there were 2 different kind of media personalities, far-right media personalities who, named me, Dan Collins from The Guardian, Pau Gas again from ABC, and Simeon Tego from The Washington Post, and asked Aldo Mariategui in particular, a columnist at Peru 21, asked for his readers to write to us, to write to the editors, to complain about our biased coverage. Beto Ortiz, a very well-known media personality as well on this channel called Wilex, which is kind of a right-wing channel owned by a local businessman. He also kind of put us in focus. And I think it's interesting because that they're doing this because, first of all, neither of those 2 really presented arguments about what exactly they object to in our coverage. So it's hard to understand exactly what they're so upset about. But I think in general, it's the focus. We're focusing a little bit more on human rights issues, on the deaths of civilians in these protests. And I think that is more than any kind of ideological leaning that they could be perceiving. I think that's what's uncomfortable for them. And I think that speaks also to this hope maybe that the momentum that I think we kind of see here in terms of seeking justice for deaths of civilians and protests, which, as Jo Marie pointed out, is nothing new. It's happened all this century through democracy, and with no cases resolved. She mentions one, but I think there's a bit of momentum here in terms of the focus that foreign media and also independent media, which has been growing in Peru. I think that they're hoping to maybe stop that. And yeah, that's, I think the clearest example of that is, there were protests by a far right group called La Resistencia, which has repeatedly kind of focused on harassing Gustavo Gurriti, this legendary Peruvian journalist who actually was kidnapped by Fujimori's regime back in the 90s and has done incredible reporting, investigative reporting since. He's kind of been a target of La Resistencia for several years. And this week, protesters were outside of his house, making anti-Semitic slurs, things like that. They also went outside of the house of Rosa Maria Palacios, who's a kind of a lawyer and a commentator, I guess you could say, a journalist. And in the case of Rosa Maria, she's not left-leaning at all. I think the only thing that she's really been done that has upset some people is she's focused a little bit more on human rights and kind of spoken up for the victims of these different incidents. So it's a challenging time, I think, in general. There hasn't been much of I haven't seen any real gestures from the government in terms of wanting to instruct police to be more careful or more respectful of the work that journalists are doing. It's important to note that most journalists, that I think local journalists are the most vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. And have been for years. I actually was in Cusco recently and I spoke to a local journalist named Vidal Merma, who has done reporting on another mining conflict there for years. And the things he described to me were just absolutely outrageous in terms of both the reaction from different bosses at the networks he was working at, but also police harassment, trying to seize his video footage, searching his house. I think he was arrested at different points, being followed. So there are, in particular, regional journalists that I think face particular challenges because they don't tend to be in the spotlight as much, and their cases, when these kinds of incidents do happen, aren't really heard of as much. But it's clear that this is not going to end now, and it's unclear exactly how things will develop. I think a lot will depend on what happens with these cases of civilians being killed, if there actually will be a serious attempt to find justice or to establish some sort of justice for them, or not. I think it'll determine who ends up feeling more powerful, whether it's the side that's kind of more critical or aggressive with journalists, or the other side. But I'm happy to take questions if there's anything else.
Thank you very much, Mitra, for your presentation. And it's very insightful to hear about the work that you've been doing, how the situation about journalists, the challenges that journalists are facing in the context of the process. And now I would like to speak a little bit about the human rights challenges. My name is Salvador Herencia Carrasco, and I'm with the Human Rights Research and Education Center. And if I were to sum up my perspective from what Diego, Jo Marie, and Mitra have said, is uncertainty. I'm not, and I'm speaking on a personal level, I am not sure what is happening, but I know that it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. This uncertainty, or almost this standstill that we have in the protest, doesn't mean that the problem has been solved. As we've mentioned before, according to the Office of the Ombudsperson, we have 60 people that have died, including one police officer that was assassinated by extremists. And we have 1,881 people that have been injured, including police officers and civilians. These are big numbers in a context of 2.5 months, including Christmas break, because there was a break in a way, or a truce between the Christmas break and New Year's Eve. Of the 60 people, according to a report from Amnesty International, okay, of the 60 victims, 80% of these 60 victims were either rural workers or indigenous people. If you understand or have read anything about Peru or Peru's history, this percentage should not be surprising. Based on the 2003 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, 85% of the 69,000 victims were from regions where the majority of the population were rural or indigenous. Ayacucho, Cusco, Junín, some of the centers of the regions where the main focus of the violent protests have taken place. it is important for us to understand that when we talk about the ethnic and racial discrimination, this is not trying to find a nuanced point of view. This is to understand and to put at the forefront a historical process of my country. This is the situation of Peru. But this is not an elite, as I have read in some views. Peru's Davos group are 5 families. Okay, this right-wing conservative to extreme goes across social levels. And it is important for us to understand this, that this is not the poor, the super mega elite of a country fueling all of this conflict. There are elements across the social spectrum of the country. To understand this is also to stop and to understand why many of these things are happening. And this is why, in a way, how Jo-Marie Bird, Professor Bird mentioned, the lack of successful prosecution, because the advocacy groups and the lawyers and NGOs working have very limited resources. And 60 people dead should be enough for a government to resign. And what we see here is, unfortunately, this was bound to happen. In November 2020, there was a big social protest in Peru during the announcing of another president. Okay, and Merino, who lasted 6 days as president, he adopted a law 31012, one of the few laws that he managed to adopt. This law established or struck down the proportionality requirement in the use of force by the police. So Diego mentioned in his intervention about the use of UN guidelines, the UN standards, how the rules on the use of force, the progressiveness. That law is struck down. In addition to that, that law affected the access to information, or limited the access to information, and limited the success of prosecutions. If you don't have information, how can you build a case? It's very simple. 101 criminal procedure class. That's the legal framework today. So we can talk about many different things about the social racial elements, but the fact is that the laws today, February 23rd, authorize this element. And a police officer, when he has the orders to control a protest, whether if it's pacific or violent, he or she will not be thinking about, oh, the conventionality control. Oh, yes, the UN adopted these standards. No. What are your marching orders? And the defenses against any prosecution. That is why, and this is not a phenomenon exclusive to Peru. The fact that officers do not have their IDs or they not have their identification, it's based on that. And we have seen that in Colombia and in Chile. Okay. So in this context, if you have a favorable legal framework that fosters impunity, bringing cases to court is complicated. How do you build a case if you do not have information? How do you build a case if you cannot identify either which battalion or division or police precinct this officer was a member of? What happens when you see footage and all of a sudden there is a blackout of the closed circuit cameras for public security? And by coincidence, in that moment when the police officer was shooting a tear gas in the chest of a civilian, that footage is no longer available. There's no such thing as a free lunch. There are no such things as coincidence. And this, in order to start concluding my presentation, based on the weight of this terrorist approach, or pro-terruco, as they say in my country, this is not just political spiel. Before the start of the protest, the chief prosecutor ordered that anybody arrested on the context of the protests were to be under the jurisdiction of the Organized Crime and Anti-Terrorist Division. A peaceful protester being prosecuted by the Organized Crime Division? Does that make sense? In addition to that, you've had, and there is, I can send you the clips if you write to me, you have prosecutors in a hearing, televised, saying that if you have a book of marks, you might be charged on pro-terrorist charges. In addition to that, you have a judge, and I see that that was one of the questions that are being asked, that if you use your free speech to call for a constitutional assembly, regardless of anyone's position about a constitutional assembly, that can amount to hate speech. So you have a political terruqueo. You have a structural administrative unit saying that all of you people arrested are going to be under the Organized Crime Division. You have prosecutors and judges doing this, or saying this, things that not even the Simpsons would be capable of saying in a script. Then you see the marginalized and the disprotection that victims have in that. The work that we have been doing at the Human Rights Clinic has been to support NGOs on the ground. We have filed cases, habeas corpuses, right, against arbitrary detentions, against the attack on a university where 205 people were arrested because they were camping on university grounds. And they wanted to charge them with terrorist charges because they are poor people that don't have a place to stay and don't have food. Because of that, they were sent to the Organized Crime Division. Does that make sense? Including children. And women were sexually abused and sexually raped at the precinct. It is a lot of uncertainty. I am happy to say that at least the only case that has been admitted for judicial review in Peru has been one case that our center has co-filed with two leading organizations in Peru. But that's the only one of perhaps dozens of other habeas corpuses and other cases that are being filed in the country. And that's problematic because a lot of these dismissals have been pretty much because there is a state of emergency, we cannot judicially review the case, which is absurd because in context of political division and human rights violations, judicial review is the most important tool that we have to prevent this from happening. So for me, the situation is concerning, but I know building on the work that Diego did when he was many years ago, and many other NGOs and human rights lawyers in Peru, that if there is impunity, it is going to be not because of lack of legal action. And that's my personal commitment, and that's the support of our research, Human Rights Research and Education Center, where we're going to keep helping victims and organizations, if we deem necessary, to address the arbitrary detentions, denounces of sexual violence, and most likely extrajudicial executions that will happen in the country before the situation gets better. So I'll leave it out here, and thank you very much for your attention. So now we've been having a lot of questions here. Mr. Andrew Ng has to leave now, but he asked me if he could have a first approach because there were some questions regarding the position of Canada. So Andrew, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Salvador. Now, it wasn't my intention to take up time that the esteemed panelists should be taking up, but given there was some discussion in the chat about the position of Canada, I thought it was worth clarifying what I said at the outset, which is that Canada's policy with regards to the government of Peru is that we've recognized democratic governments in Peru. We recognize the July 2021 election that brought to power Castillo, and we've engaged with that previous government. We expressed our deep concern with the unconstitutional attempt by former President Castillo to close Congress. We subsequently recognized the succession, the democratic and constitutional succession process of President Boluarte to the presidency, and Canada doesn't take a position on the Peruvian constitution. We simply recognize that there has been a constitutional succession according to the Peruvian constitution. All that said, with regards to our position on the government, we have expressed our concerns about the human rights situation to the government in public and in private, as I laid out, and as our panelists have highlighted, and that will continue to be part of our ongoing dialogue with the government. So thank you again, Salvador, and to all the panelists. I have other colleagues on the line from Global Affairs Canada. I just regret I'll need to step out about 15 minutes early. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your comment. I think that there are two questions that I've seen from the audience, and also one made from Andrew, that perhaps to get a starting point. This is a question to everybody, to Jo Marie, Diego, and Mitra. One, what is the role of international organization? Like the UN High Commission of Human Rights have visited the country. The Inter-American Commission has visited the country 2 times. Hopefully they'll present a report soon enough. It's been 6 weeks now. They're already 2 weeks late. What do you see this role, their role in this process? And also a point that I don't think we have really discussed here in our initial presentations is regarding the Constitutional Assembly. There are calls by different groups that this is the time to call for drafting a new constitution. Regardless of personal opinions or positions on this matter, like we have a seminar just on that, how do you think that this is an alternative, a viable alternative? Would this help pacify the country in a way? So let's just start first with Diego, then Jo Marie, and then Mitra.
Thank you, Salvador. Well, two very big questions. The first one, the role of international organizations, may sound obvious, no? Is to follow up very closely the evolution of the situation with the principles that are already established in international instruments, and specifically follow up the specific cases or situations of alleged human rights violation that have been presented to the Human Rights Commission or to the UN bodies. It's important to stress strongly the work that should be done with objectivity and neutrality by the Public Prosecutor's Office, which is not the case in Peru now, in which many proofs are absolutely lost because they have too many time elapsed between the facts, like the one that the guy that was killed by una bomba lacrimógena, and no investigation was made, so the proofs that the film was lost after 1 week, and while the public prosecutor hadn't made any step forward to make that investigation. Of course, the human rights system should continue in place, and it's unacceptable to avoid any kind of follow-up, beginning again the discussion to leave the Inter-American system. The Constituent Assembly, in a context in which we have a Congress of lack of support, in which the government has a little bit more support than the Congress, but as well very low. Obviously, that's the first thing that assumes that a political way out now, which doesn't mean necessarily that the big problems will be solved. That we see that general elections to replace this Congress and to appoint a new government in a context in which that historical gap between the political system and the real society of Peru comes already from the Spanish conquest in Peru, with a crisis that has never been positively solved. Of course, a new general election won't solve that matter as well, as easy, but at least a matter of a government and a Congress that has some legitimacy and some transparency in its process of election. The change of the constitution, of course, is a matter that can eventually be raised, but in the proper context, while there are clear rules for the elections and clear political debate. What is the context actually? The context in which many people that claim for the Constituent Assembly, when they are asked, well, what do you need to be changed in the Constitution, actually is the big historical claims of a country in which exclusion with violation of social and economical rights for millions of people during hundreds of years. It's obvious that the new constitutional text by itself won't solve any kind of that, because if that doesn't follow a big political change in the country. What is the context? If you make a poll in Peru right now to imagine what could be eventually a new constitution, more than 70% of the people support the idea of reimplementing death penalty. More than 70% of the people in the poll reject any kind of discussion about matrimonio igualitario. To give two examples of the kind of what that could be, the result in a context in which political debate is in a way closed, in which exclusion is a so important thing that requires big political changes. Of course, in that process, a new constitution could be an important step forward, but for the actual crisis in Peru, to open that is a kind of deviate to what right now requires is to this Congress should go, this government should be replaced by a new elected government, but in a clear process, an open debate, which in that context, of course, the society can discuss with the matters that can be dealt in a new constitution, a new main political changes, because finally, what we are dealing is not a question of what happened after Castillo was elected, but a long history of Peru of exclusion, in which a big part of the Peruvian population had been out of the political institutional system.
Muchas gracias, Diego. Thank you very much. Jo Marie, please.
Thanks, Salvador. I think in terms of the role of international organizations, I just like to add to what Diego said that both international journalists and international organizations like the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, like the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, like Amnesty International, like Human Rights Watch, have all played a fundamental role, right, in documenting what's been happening on the ground and conveying that information to the world. In a context in which in Peru, the media is very highly concentrated. One economic group, the Grupo Comercio, controls 80% of the media, the traditional media. And so the role of both independent or digital journalism and international journalists and these international organizations is fundamental to documenting what is actually happening and to countering the government's narrative that these are all criminals and terrorists. And I think that's one of the reasons, speaking to what Mitra said earlier, I think that's one of the reasons there is this campaign by right-wing, brokers like Beto Ortiz and Aldo Mariátegui to silence foreign journalists and to get Peru to withdraw from the Inter-American system, right? They want a closed system where they control the narrative, right? And so international organizations and international press play a critical role. As for an Asamblea Constituyente or a constitutional assembly, I agree that there are real risks for doing that right now, given the instability, the lack of political parties in Peru. I think it's not necessarily a problem that Peruvians want an Asamblea Constituyente. I think that, you know, countries adopt new constitutions all the time. Maybe not my country. My constitution is, our constitution is very old, but a lot of countries adopt new constitutions. And I think that the people who are demanding a new constitution have strong arguments that they've never really been included. The indigenous people, the people who live in rural and Amazonian areas, have never really been included. They've never really been able to participate in a constituent process. So I think there's something valid there. And I do think there are many problems with the current constitution. I don't think we have time to get into that discussion right now, both economic, in terms of the way the political system is structured, and other issues as well. So I do think it's a valid point. But I think right now what we need is, there's an impasse in the situation in Peru right now. Protesters are not going to back down, it seems. The current elite's idea that, oh, they're going to dissipate with time and we'll consolidate our power. I'm not so sure that's the case. And what they've been doing in the meantime is beefing up their repressive apparatus. They've extended the state of emergency. The military is in direct control of social order in Puno, for example, where 18 people were killed on January 9th. The government has transferred millions of dollars to the Ministry of Defense to beef up the repressive apparatus. The Boluarte regime just proposed new legislation extending the criminal sentences for those charged of crimes committed during a state of emergency, which Peru now, large segments of the population now live under. So right now we need to get to a solution to what's happening right now. And it's clear, you know, the Congress has refused, in this most recent legislative session that just closed, the Congress has refused to move forward with legislation that would facilitate early general elections. So the only solution right now that's constitutional is for Dina Boluarte to resign. And she's clearly stated that she's not prepared to do this. So we are at a situation of impasse. And so I think that here the international community could play another important role, which is to facilitate and mediate between these two now very hardened political positions, where there's no middle ground anymore. And unless we do that, this is going to become an intractable conflict where there's not just a human rights crisis, but potentially a humanitarian crisis. Thanks.
Thank you, Jo Marie. Mitra, please.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think if you include in international organizations, foreign media, I do think Peru is kind of particularly like a self-conscious country, and that it's always interested in what is being said about it around the world. There's kind of a regular segment of news where it's like, como lo reportó la prensa extranjera, like how foreign media reported on such and such thing, which I think is actually a healthy exercise that the US could adopt to get a sense of itself in the world.
It's part of our idiosyncrasy.
Idiosyncrasy, exactly. So in that sense, yeah, I think foreign media has is quite influential. It's actually, you know, quite a privilege to work for foreign media in Peru. I was in Cusco recently. On the way back, you know, there were just so many blockades. We negotiated our way through 3 of them, basically by identifying ourselves as foreign media with an interest in hearing what they have to say about what they're doing. And with time that, you know, they would let us through, and you know, local media, I think even journalists who deserve to be trusted, who do a good job and try to give kind of a fair view of things, don't get that they don't have that luxury. So that speaks to, I think, the role of foreign media in Peru. But you know, the other side of that is that, you know, there is a large section of the population on the right that does see foreign media as kind of working with the terrorist, or working with Progresillo, or we're being portrayed in that way, that we're not doing real journalism, which is quite frustrating. But yeah, I think in terms of the international image of Peru, I think just this morning the finance minister mentioned that I think they're setting aside 150 million to invest in different tourism campaigns, part of an effort to improve the image of Peru. So yeah, I think it matters quite a lot. On the Constituent Assembly, it's been interesting to watch the kind of debate over this evolve over the years. Because when I first came here, it was, at most it was kind of Veronica Mendoza and other leftists would talk about it as, it's the kind of, in a lot of ways, their most important proposal. But you never really saw a kind of a debate really about it when I was here. I understand that during the transition to democracy, there was talk about putting it in the constitution then to replace the one written by Fujimori, which many saw as legitimate because it happened through a self-coup. And yet, it hasn't been until now, until these protests, that I think it's really kind of been being talked about. And the proof of that is that I think we're seeing the first polls ever really about how much support there is for it, which is something we just never saw before. It was just, or at most it would be, in the list of priorities, how big of a priority is it? So I think these protests have brought that to the forefront, and we'll be seeing more debate about the merits of it and what one would look like, or if it's better to just do a bunch of constitutional reforms to fix the issues with the Constitution related to impeachment and cuestión de confianza, the vote of confidence for closing Congress. But it looks really kind of like a long shot to me still, just because I think it's very divisive in terms of the left and the right. We're in this hyperpolarized moment. The right sees it as a vehicle for installing some sort of a leftist dictatorship, and they're not really, so far, haven't really approached it in a way. But again, there's no real, even on the left, there's no real proposals. Like what is it that you want to see in there? I think there needs to be more debate along those lines. And if it does happen, if there is enough political support for it to happen, it may be a way to restore the trust in democratic institutions that we've seen basically collapse with so many political crises. That would be a positive outcome, I think, if it does happen.
Thank you very much, Mitra. We're almost running out of time, but there was a question about the use of the term terrorism and the limits to the use of force. I just wanted to point out that this goes without saying that the state has the constitutional and legal duty to keep peace and security, right? Including in the context of social protests. But that duty does not include shooting civilians at point blank. That duty does not involve harassing or attacking members of the press who are just covering or doing their job, covering some news. And this is a lot of the debate in Peru has been happening about the use of lethal weapons. And I think that is not the right term, because it's not if they are using lethal weapons or not, but if the weapons that they're used, whatever they may be, are used with intent to kill. Okay, a tear gas is not deadly per se, but depending how you use it, that can cause serious harm, including death. And this is not just in Peru. In Chile, there's a highly documented reports about the use of dum-dum guns that were shot at the eye of a person, of civilians. The same thing in Colombia. So these are things that go beyond any constitutional or legal duty. And also in the context of terrorism, there's always an ambiguity about what is terrorism, as the legislation is different from country to country. But when there was this military police raid at the University of San Marcos, the 33 students that were arrested, that they were in their dorms, they were charged not with usurpación, or the illegal appropriation of someone else's inmueble, house, or territory. They were charged with terrorism. And they were immediately released. So there is a political use of a type of crime that should be used only exceptionally. And if you don't have checks and balances, and if the judiciary does not stand up to its job, these situations will continue to happen. It can be students, as it was almost 3 weeks ago. It can be racialized communities, indigenous communities. If they did what they did at San Marcos University on a live broadcast in one of the largest universities in Peru, you can imagine what they would do with the right motivations in universities, in rural universities, or in places where people are not social media broadcasting or televising. So that's the concern. So I would like to give Diego, Jo Marie, and Mitra their just final remarks, and to thank them again for being here with us today. Diego, por favor.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Salvador, por la invitación. Es un debate intenso. Hay preguntas que quedan pendientes. Acabo de leer un comentario de alguien que dice que no hemos hablado de la corrupción. Es verdad, es un telón de fondo absolutamente fundamental, que es un cáncer que atraviesa todo y explica buena parte de los temas de debilidad institucional que tenemos. Pero finalmente es una larga historia de exclusión la que está sobre el tapete y la que tiene que enfrentarse, tal vez con algunos remedios inmediatos, de una vez que hay elecciones generales, para limpiar un poco el panorama y abrir debates en serio, como lo que ha planteado Mitra, de temas constitucionales que sin duda están pendientes, pero tiene que haber una discusión en serio y no una precipitación para que de pronto salgamos con una constitución regresiva o autoritaria como la que podría surgir de la noche a la mañana. Muchísimas gracias, gran idea tener este debate y un gusto personalmente de haber podido compartir este panel con Jean-Marie y Mitra. Muchas gracias. Adiós a todas y todos.
Gracias, Diego. Jean-Marie, por favor.
Gracias, Salvador. Yo creo que quisiera cerrar con una pequeña reflexión sobre el tema de democracia en el Perú. Uno de los refranes que se escucha en las marchas fue el título de un artículo que escribí en La República la semana pasada. Esa democracia ya no es democracia. Si nosotros pensamos en democracia como elecciones, bueno, hubo elecciones y Dina Boluarte por la renuncia o el arresto de Pedro Castillo constitucionalmente asume el poder. Pero democracia es más allá de las elecciones, es más allá de cómo uno llega al poder, es cómo uno ejerce el poder. Y en las ciencias sociales hace tiempo ya se vienen tratando de entender democracias que caen, que empiezan a tener retrocesos, democratic backslide. Oh, sorry, I switched to Spanish. I don't know why I did that. I'm very sorry. I think that was because of Diego. Sorry, I'm going to go back to English, because of democratic backsliding. And I think this concept is really important in the Peruvian context, because I think what we're seeing is not just a deterioration or a weakening of democratic institutions, but increasingly an exercise of power that is increasingly authoritarian. I'm not saying this is a full-on authoritarian government, but there are practices that are deeply disturbing and that reflect democratic backsliding in a very real way. So when my government, the United States government, says, well, we're supporting democracy in Peru. Well, democracy in Peru is on life support. And so what exactly are you doing to support that democracy? And I think that we need better ways of engaging in this discussion about how to deal with countries that are sliding into authoritarianism. The problem here is not just repression. It's not just human rights violations and people being detained. That is a problem, and one that I think is deeply concerning, but there's also a broader problem of democratic backsliding and maybe even veering into some sort of hybrid regime or authoritarianism that is deeply concerning, especially given Peru's very recent past with the dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori. I'll wrap it up there. Thank you again. And it was also a pleasure to be with Diego and Mitra and with you, Salvador.
No, thank you very much, Jean-Marie. Mitra, please.
I'm not sure exactly what I'd like to say to wrap it up, but you mentioned before that one of the things that foreign media does is, or has been doing, is putting a little bit more of a focus on not just human rights, but also on these ethnic and racial divisions. And I think that's something that we'll probably see continue to be a more important element of politics. I think this awareness of indigenous identity or indigenous, I think it's growing in general. There's a sense of empowerment that will probably not be easily just done away with. The protests, I think, at least in the area that I was in recently in Cusco, protesters say that they were going on a break, like they did kind of over the Christmas holidays, and will be resuming in March. So I think it remains to be seen if it's over or if this is going to be a kind of a more drawn out conflict. And the government certainly and the police have the opportunity, I think, going forward to change. And the future, I think, will, as you said, be written by kind of what happens with these cases and whether this kind of impunity continues or not.
Thank you very much, Mitra. So before we conclude and wrap up, just a couple of parochial announcements. One, first of all, thank you very much to our translator, Madame Spitzer and Madame Gonzalez. Your work is amazing, and thank you very much for your help. I would also like to thank the support that the Canadian Embassy in Peru has been doing in the past years. We have been working with them for almost a year now in different activities, and we will continue to do so, hopefully. And hopefully we will, this is not the only panel on Peru or only any other countries in Latin America. Our Human Rights Research and Education Center is heavily invested in working on the issues of Latin America, human rights and democracy. So please connect with our social media handles, we subscribe to our newsletters. We have a lot of more activities coming your way. And for me, it was an absolute pleasure to host and speak a little bit about the situation in my country and to have wonderful speakers like Mitra Taj, Diego Garcia Sayan, and Jo-Marie Burt. I see in the chat a lot of people are very happy with this webinar. I'm very happy. It was a lot of work, but to see your comments, it makes it all worthy, especially to Jose Azula. Thank you very much for that comment. It makes us feel better. And strive us to makes all of us work harder. So muchas gracias. Thank you very much to everybody. We will post in the next few days this webinar on YouTube and on our social media. So hasta una próxima. Muchísimas gracias a todas y todos.
Gracias. Chao.
Chao, chao.